I want to be clear about what I am and am not claiming. I am not claiming that the Harlow House step-down facility is a dangerous place. I am not claiming that any of the residents were a threat to me or to each other or to anyone. I am not making a formal complaint. What I am doing, and I am doing it now, while I still can, while my experience of that 8 months still feels sufficiently like my own, is writing down what I observed in the order that I observed it, and trying to make sense of the point at which something I had understood as a professional relationship began to feel like something else. I was hired as a residential counselor in mid-March, and I worked the overnight shift, 10 in the evening to 6 in the morning, until the first week of November. 8 months. The facility was a residential step-down unit, which is a specific kind of place that most people haven't heard of, and which I should describe for the sake of clarity. Step-down care sits between inpatient psychiatric hospitalization and independent living. The residents, not patients, we did not use the word patients, were adults who had completed acute psychiatric care and were not yet stable enough to live on their own. Harlow House had 8 beds. At any given point, 6 or 7 of those beds were occupied, sometimes all 8. Residents stayed on average 4 to 8 weeks, though a few stayed longer, and 1 or 2 had been there so long that their presence had become, I think, structural. They were part of how the house ran. The building itself was an older Victorian conversion, 3 floors in a residential neighborhood, 1 street behind a commercial strip. There was a modest parking area in the back, screened by a wooden fence that was always slightly damp. Inside, a common room on the ground floor with a television and a long table and a kitchen counter with a coffee maker that ran all day. A staff office just off the common room, which was where I spent most of the shift when I wasn't on rounds. A medication room. A quiet room, which was a small, dim room with 2 upholstered chairs and a box of tissues used for one-on-one check-ins. In the residential rooms upstairs, single occupancy, each with a window, a bed, a desk, a small wardrobe. The clinical director was a woman named Dr. Perot. She was in the building during business hours, 3 days a week, and available by phone the other days. The day shift had 2 counselors. The evening shift had 1. I was the overnight. And I was alone in the building with the residents from 10 until 6, except for the occasional agency nurse who came in for medication reviews and the weekly housekeeping visit on Thursday mornings. I want to say clearly that I liked the job. I want to say this because what follows might suggest that I was unhappy there, or that the atmosphere was hostile, or that something was wrong from the start. None of that is true. I had worked in residential care before, and I knew the rhythms. I like nights. I like the particular quality of silence in that house after midnight, when the common room was empty and the coffee maker had cycled off, and the only sounds were the settling of old joinery, and occasionally a resident moving in their room upstairs, the brief creak of a bed, the sound of someone awake and quiet. And there is a kind of companionship in that, being awake in a building while others sleep. There were 5 long-term residents when I started, and over the following months, 3 others rotated through. The long-term residents were Odette, who had been at Harlow House for almost a year by the time I arrived, and who had a quiet, very organized way of moving through the world. Reuben, in his mid-30s, who drew obsessively in a series of black sketchbooks, and who was kind in the way of people who have had to learn kindness from the outside in. Mira, 40-something, who had persistent insomnia, and who spent most nights I worked reading in the common room, in a particular chair near the window, until I asked her, gently, to go back to her room. Dale, who had been a building contractor and who did not discuss why he was at Harlow House, and with whom I maintained a cordial and largely wordless working relationship. And Priya, the youngest, who had arrived the month before me, and who made coffee for everyone at 6 in the morning, even before the day shift came in, which meant she was always up before I finished my last rounds. The procedures at Harlow House were reasonable and clear. They were given to me in the form of a laminated orientation guide, a verbal walkthrough with the outgoing overnight counselor, and a subsequent verbal review with Dr. Perot. I did not find them unusual. I still don't entirely. Wellness checks were every 2 hours, at midnight, 2 in the morning, and 4 in the morning. I knocked on each resident's door, said their name, waited for a verbal response. If I received one, I logged it and continued. If I did not receive one within 30 seconds, I knocked again. If there was still no response, I used my key and performed a visual check. I kept a log on a paper form attached to a clipboard in the staff office, and the day shift reviewed it each morning. The entries were simple: initials, time, verbal confirmation, any notes. The medication window was at 10:30 each evening. Residents who were prescribed anything, which was most of them, lined up in the hallway outside the medication room. I verified their identity against the medication administration record, dispensed what was prescribed, and watched them take it. Not watched in a surveillance way, watched in the way that is expected and understood in that context. Some residents preferred to chat during the medication window. When others were quiet, Odette always said thank you in a way that suggested she was thanking me for something larger than the cup of water. Residents were not to be in each other's rooms after 11. This was a boundary rule, not a punitive one. It was explained to new residents on intake as a privacy measure. In practice, people went to their own rooms and closed their doors, and that was the end of it. There was no midnight migration, no drama around this. It was simply a boundary that everyone understood and kept. The quiet room was available to residents at any time during the night if they were experiencing distress. A resident who requested a quiet room check-in would knock on the staff office door, and I would spend 15 minutes with them in the quiet room, and I would document the session, time, duration, a brief description of presenting concerns, any actions taken, in the incident log. This happened a few times a month. It was, in my experience, one of the more meaningful parts of the work. Finally, all clinical communications, meaning anything that required a call to Dr. Perot or to an on-call clinician, had to be made from the facility landline in the staff office. The policy stated that this was for documentation purposes, since the landline was on a call logging system. We were not to use our personal phones for clinical calls. I followed this without exception. Those were the procedures. They remained the same across my 8 months at the facility. What changed was not the procedures. What changed was what I began to notice while performing them. The first thing I noticed, and I want to say again that at the time I noticed it as nothing more than a professional curiosity, happened in my second month. It was a night in May, a Wednesday, and the house was unusually settled. All the residents in their rooms by 11, no quiet room requests, the common room empty and dim. I had finished the midnight check and was back in the staff office when Odette knocked. She was not in distress. She said she couldn't sleep and wanted to ask me something. She asked if I had ever had a recurring dream that felt more like a location than a dream, a place you kept going back to rather than a narrative that repeated. I said I thought most people had something like that. She said she had been going back to a specific room lately, a room she had never been in waking life, with pale green walls and a single window, and a smell like cedar and salt. She described it in detail: the dimensions of the window, the quality of the light, a water stain on the ceiling near the light fixture that was shaped like a blunt peninsula. She said the dream had been recurring for about 3 weeks. I made a note of it because it seemed clinically relevant. Recurring spatial dreams in residents in step-down care can be a marker for a number of things, and I logged it in the incident record as a brief note under her name. Not a full quiet room session. She had not requested one. Just a note. The following morning, before I went home, Priya was making coffee in the common room, and Mira was sitting at the table with a book she was not reading, which was her way of being sociable. I was doing my end-of-shift notes at the edge of the table. Mira said to no one in particular that she had been having a dream she couldn't shake. Priya asked what kind. Mira said it was a room. She said, pale green walls, one window, a cedar smell. She said there was a water stain on the ceiling. I looked up from my notes. Priya said, what shape? Mira thought about it and said it looked like a map of a peninsula, blunt-ended, near the light. Priya said she didn't know what to say to that. Mira said she just kept going back to it. I sat there for a moment longer than I should have, holding my pen, and then I wrote the rest of my shift notes and I went home and I slept. And when I woke up, I considered 3 possibilities. The first was that Odette had mentioned the dream to Mira in passing during the day, and Mira had absorbed the imagery and incorporated it into her own sleep. This happens. It is a known phenomenon in group residential settings where shared emotional material circulates through conversation and becomes a kind of ambient subtext. The second possibility was that the dream was not remarkable and I was pattern matching coincidentally, that water stains shaped vaguely like land masses are common, and that cedar and salt is a smell that many people associate with restful spaces and might independently describe as dreamlike. The third possibility was what it was. I chose the first explanation. I made a note in my private notebook, not the facility log, describing both accounts and noting the similarity. Then I closed the notebook. I went back to work that evening, and the next, and the one after, and nothing unusual happened for almost 3 weeks. And I put the green room away in the same mental cabinet where I keep things I do not need to address. The phrase was harder to explain away. In late May, Dale came to the medication window in a state I can only describe as gently perplexed. He took his medication and stood for a moment after, holding the small paper cup, and said, "The water was the wrong color today." I said, "The tap water?" He said he didn't know. He said he'd been thinking it all day and couldn't place where the thought was from. He set the cup down and went upstairs. 2 weeks later, during a quiet room session with Reuben, he came in occasionally not in acute distress, but simply, I think, because he liked having a structured space in which to talk. Reuben mentioned that he had been trying to draw something all week that wasn't coming out right. He said the colors in his head were wrong. He said it was like trying to draw water when the water was the wrong color. I waited a beat and asked what he meant by that. He said he couldn't explain it. He said sometimes he had a sense of wrongness about a color that he couldn't justify technically, but that he couldn't ignore either. I asked if this was distressing. He said no. He said it was more like a thought someone else had left behind. A thought someone else had left behind. I wrote that down during the session because it seemed like his phrasing, not borrowed from anywhere, and good phrasing deserves to be recorded. I kept it in my private notebook. I was writing quite a lot in my private notebook by June. The third time I heard a variation on the phrase was from Priya in the first week of June at 5:30 in the morning while she was making coffee. I had not spoken to her about either Dale's or Reuben's comments. I had not logged the phrase in any way that would have been visible to residents. Priya, with her back to me, said, "Does water ever look wrong to you? Not the taste, just the color." I said I wasn't sure I knew what she meant. She said, "Like sometimes it looks slightly wrong, like you're looking at it through glass that doesn't match." I said that sounded like a visual disturbance and asked if she'd mentioned it to Dr. Perot. Priya said no, she had only noticed it when she was almost asleep. She said it was probably nothing. And I drank my coffee and finished my end-of-shift paperwork and went home. I have been trying since then to find a single common source for the phrase. I have not found one. The three residents had no reason, as far as I could determine, to have discussed the perception among themselves. They were not particularly close, did not spend unusual amounts of time in each other's company, and in Priya's case, had come to the facility after the phrase had first appeared in Dale and then in Reuben. I have considered whether I myself had used the phrase in their presence, as a figure of speech offhandedly, in a way I had forgotten. I have no memory of this, but I am honest enough to acknowledge that an offhand phrase used once, during a long night when I was tired, could easily vanish from my recollection while remaining in someone else's. And I have not resolved this. I include it only because it was the second instance of a shared perception that should not have been shared, and because the word Reuben used, left behind, is still the closest I have come to a description of the mechanism. What happened in July was not possible. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only thing I have left in the certain parts of this account. In July, on a Saturday during the second break of my shift, I took breaks in the parking lot, 15 minutes, around 2 in the morning. I dropped my keys. The parking lot was lit by a single sodium lamp on the fence, which cast a warm orange-amber light across the pavement and turned everything within it the same yellowed color. When I bent down to pick up the keys, I happened to look up, through the gap between the fence and the lip of the roof overhang, and I saw the moon. It was almost full, bright enough to wash out the stars nearby, and it was positioned precisely, geometrically, with the neatness of something arranged. Exactly between the tops of two telephone poles on the street side of the fence. Framed. I stood with my keys in my hand and looked at it for about a minute. It was one of those moments that arrives without invitation. The kind of incidental beauty that requires no response except the act of seeing it. Then I went back inside. I did not mention this to anyone. 3 days later, on a Tuesday, Dale requested a quiet room check-in. He had been sleeping badly and wanted to talk about it. We sat in the quiet room and he talked for a while about the content of the sleeplessness. Not nightmares, he said. She just thoughts. The accumulation of small thoughts that become load-bearing when you can't put them down at night. Near the end of the 15 minutes, with a kind of afterthought quality that I have since thought about a great deal, he said, I keep seeing this image, like a photograph, the moon between two poles. I asked him to describe it. He described it. The amber light, the pale, full disk sitting perfectly in the gap, the quality of the framing. He said it felt like a memory, but he didn't think it was his. He said he had asked himself where it was from and could not find an answer. He went to his room. I sat in the quiet room for a few minutes after, alone with the door open, looking at the small window that showed the side wall of the house next door and not the parking lot, which was on the opposite side of the building. Only Dale's window was also on the opposite side of the building. He had been in his room, confirmed by the midnight check 3 hours earlier, during the break in which I had stood in the parking lot and looked at the moon. I returned to the staff office. I sat at the desk. I did not pick up the facility phone to call anyone. I did not have the language for what I would have said. I wrote in my private notebook. Dale described the parking lot, 2:15 a.m., Saturday. His room does not face the parking lot. He was in his room at 2:15 a.m. on Saturday. He described it as a memory that wasn't his. Then I closed the notebook and finished the shift. There is something I should explain about the common room phone, because the phone becomes important later. The facility landline had a standard ring, a single sustained tone, 2 seconds, then a pause, or then another 2 seconds. This was the same ring I had heard on every facility phone I had ever worked with. Institutional single-tone ring. I had been answering it reflexively since my first week. At some point in late July, I cannot pinpoint the date more precisely, which frustrates me. I picked up the phone after hours to call the answering service about a prescription question, and I noticed that the ringtone had changed, not to a different single ring, to a double ring, 2 short tones, a pause, 2 short tones. It is a common phone setting. Many offices use it, but it is also the ring that my parents' house had when I was growing up. Their phone had been an old one, never upgraded, and it had rung with exactly that pattern through all of my childhood. 2 quick notes, then the pause. Where I stood in the staff office with the handset in my hand, listening to it ring out to the answering service, and I told myself that someone had adjusted the ring settings, which was a thing that could be done by anyone with access to the phone system configuration, and that it happened to coincide with a pattern I recognized from childhood, and that this was the kind of coincidence that seems meaningful only because the brain is wired to find patterns in sound. I left a note for the day shift asking when the ring setting had been changed. The day shift note, returned to me that evening, said, Ring setting? I haven't touched the phone. I began testing the phone ring on subsequent nights by picking up the handset briefly before each call. The ring was consistently the double pattern from that point forward. I found the phone system manual in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet and read the section on ringtone configuration. It required a 6-digit access code. I did not know the access code. The manual said the code was set by the IT vendor who had installed the system and was not routinely shared with facility staff. I noted this in my private notebook and kept working. In August, I made a decision that I now understand as a test, although I did not acknowledge it as such at the time. I told myself I was simply doing something slightly unusual to give myself a reference point. During the medication window on an August Thursday, a slow, warm evening, all the residents cooperatively lined up. I chose silently to hum a song while I administered. Not aloud, under my breath, the way one does when music arrives in the mind without being called. The song was one my mother had sung when I was young, a song she had learned from her own mother, something folk adjacent that I had never been able to find recorded, that I had never written down or described to another person, that existed as far as I knew only in my memory and in the fact that I had learned it from her. I hummed it quietly, moving down the line, and no one commented because no one would have been able to hear it clearly, and by the end of the window I had almost forgotten doing it. The following morning, Priya was at the kitchen counter making coffee, and she was singing, not humming, singing softly with her back to me, the kind of singing people do when they think they're alone. I stopped in the doorway. I stood there for 8 or 10 seconds. And I stood there long enough to confirm that the melody was correct. Not approximately correct. Not a common tune that happened to share a phrase. Correct. The intervals were exact. The rhythm was exact. The slight elongation of the second phrase that was a particular habit of my mother's, that I had never heard from anyone else, was there. I said, Priya, where did you hear that? She turned around and looked at me blankly. She said, hear what? I said, the song you were just singing. She said she had been humming something. She hadn't realized. She didn't know where it was from. She said sometimes things just arrived. She turned back to the coffee. I went into the staff office and sat at the desk and did not move for some time. Through the small interior window that looks from the office into the common room, I could see the table, iron part of the kitchen counter, and the edge of Priya at the counter with her coffee. She had stopped singing. I want to record what I thought in the staff office during those minutes as precisely as I can. I thought, these people are sharing something, not a conversation, not a text, not a common cultural reference. They are sharing my material. Dale had a memory that was mine. Priya was singing something that came from my family and lives nowhere else. And before that, 3 of them had independently produced the same phrase about water, and 2 of them had independently described the same room in a dream. The material was moving through the residence in a direction, not horizontally between residents, which would have been explicable as group osmosis, vertically from me to them, except that I had not given it to them. And I had not spoken the moon moment to anyone. I had not hummed the song where it could be heard. I had not described the color of my water or the green room in my own dreams, if I had such dreams. I had only been in the building. I had only been present, performing my checks, sitting at my desk, making my notes, being awake in the rooms of Harlow House across hundreds of hours of nighttime shift. The pattern I was trying to form was this: the building, or the residence, or some process I did not have a name for, was registering what I experienced within its walls. Everything that happened to me inside the building, a private thought, a moment in the parking lot, a song in my head, was being received and after some delay, played back through the residents without their knowledge, now in the medium of their dreams and their language and their early morning humming. I acknowledged to myself that this pattern was not possible in the ordinary sense of the word. I also acknowledged that I had 3 documented instances and 1 undocumented one. I also acknowledged that I was 8 hours into a shift, sitting alone in a staff office while the building slept around me, and that the mind produces patterns, especially at the end of a long night, especially when one is already primed to look for them. I went home. I slept. I came back. And for the next 2 weeks, I watched. I was careful about the watching. I was careful to keep the normal shape of the work, the wellness checks, the medication window, the quiet room sessions, because the residents were real people in a real stage of recovery, and my function there was not investigative. I did not begin conversations about dreams. I did not ask about recurring images. I simply noted what arrived without prompting. What arrived was this. Reuben, during a quiet room check-in in late August, mentioned that he had been trying to draw a figure at a window and couldn't get the posture right. He said the figure was looking out from the inside of a building, not in from the outside. I asked him if the figure had a face. He said not yet. He said the posture was the thing he was working on. Something about the way a person stands when they believe they are unobserved. Mira, during the 2 in the morning wellness check on a night in early September, Age was awake and sitting up when I knocked and she called out. She said she was fine, and then, before I had closed the door, she said, I keep thinking about a notebook, someone writing very small. I said that was an interesting image. She said it came to her between sleeping and waking. She said it felt like watching someone through a window. Odette, during the medication window in the second week of September, said something she had never said before. She said she had been thinking about the overnight counselor before me, the one whose shift I had taken. She said, I used to know what she was thinking sometimes. Not clearly, more like catching the edge of a thought. I said that was an interesting observation. She said it had stopped when she left and started again, slightly differently when I arrived. Hannah, she said she didn't mean it strangely. She said she just thought I should know. I stood in the medication room for a moment after she left and looked at the wall and thought about the word again. She had said it had started again. I want to describe the incident with the phone because I have been circling it and should be direct. In mid-September, at approximately 3:40 in the morning, the common room phone rang. At 3:40 in the morning, no one calls a residential facility's main line. The answering service routes all calls. The only calls that come directly to the main line outside of business hours are from the answering service itself, passing through an emergency from a family member or an on-call clinician. I had received perhaps 4 such calls in 8 months. I went to the staff office and picked up the handset. And the line was open. There was no caller voice, no ambient office sound, no breathing I could identify. There was something, a quality of presence on the line that was different from dead air, though I cannot describe it more precisely than that. Dead air has a flatness. This was not flat. This was quiet in the way that a room is quiet when someone has recently left it. I said, Harlow House, can I help you? The line was open for another 3 or 4 seconds. Then it disconnected. I logged it as a misdial, which was the appropriate entry for an open line call with no voice. I returned to my desk. The phone rang again at 4:17. I picked it up. Same quality. I waited. Nothing spoke. I said my greeting. 4 seconds of open air, and then the disconnect. I sat looking at the phone for a while after the second call. I thought, the double ring, the calls in the deep of the night. I was trying to decide if this was coincidence assembled by a tired mind, or something that was actually building toward a shape. The third call came at 4:53. I picked it up without standing. I did not say my greeting. I sat with the handset at my ear and listened. For 31 seconds, nothing. Then a sound I am still trying to describe accurately. It was not a voice. It was closer to the sound of a room adjusting to presence. The small acoustic shift that happens when a person enters a space. The sound of air displacement, of attention. And then it ended. I set the handset back in the cradle. I completed my 4 a.m. rounds without incident. All residents were asleep. The facility was entirely still. I did not enter the 3 calls in the incident log with the quality of sound I've just described. I logged them as 3 open line calls, missed dials, no action required. The log says what the procedure required it to say. My private notebook says something different. In October, I made the decision I should probably have made in August. I told Dr. Perot that I wanted to discuss something that had been accumulating across the shift. I framed it carefully because Dr. Perot is a precise and patient thinker, and I wanted to be taken seriously. I did not mention the song. I described the shared dream as a possible example of group osmosis, which I suggested should be monitored for its clinical implications. I described the phrase about water as another possible example. I said I had noticed what seemed like a pattern of circulating material. Dr. Perot listened attentively. She said the phenomenon I was describing had a name. She called it resonance transference, which she explained as the natural consequence of prolonged close proximity between a stable attachment figure and a population in active psychological transition. She said that the overnight counselor in residential care often became a kind of narrative anchor for the residents, that their nervous systems registered the counselor's presence as safe, and that this registration extended to the unconscious, and sometimes produced what appeared to be shared imagery, because shared imagery was how the unconscious expressed perceived safety. She said it was not unusual. She said she would add a note to the group's treatment records. While she said I should not be concerned, I asked whether the effect typically ran in both directions. She asked what I meant. I said, Does it move from the anchor to the residence or also from the residence to the anchor? She paused. She said that was a more complex question and that the literature suggested resonance transference was primarily a one-way phenomenon. She said if I were feeling unusually permeable, I should consider whether I was getting enough sleep. She said it in a kind way. I thanked her and went home. I slept reasonably. I came back. What changed in October was the quality of the return material. Before October, what the residents reflected back was experiential. The moon, the song, the parking lot, the private thoughts. In October, what began to appear was structural. Though by structural, I mean the material was no longer arriving as isolated images or phrases. It was arriving in sequence, in the order it had actually occurred. Reuben's quiet room session in the second week of October began with him describing, without apparent awareness of what he was describing, a series of images from my shift 3 nights earlier. Not a single image, a sequence. He described the parking lot first, then the medication window, then the sound of the common room at 2 in the morning, which he described as a sound like held breath. Then he said he wasn't sure why he'd said any of that, and that he'd been feeling foggy lately, and maybe he should sleep more. I said that sounded like a good idea. I documented the session normally, but the sequence was correct. Parking lot, medication window, 2 a.m. quiet. It was the order in which those things had occurred during the Tuesday shift. It was not the order you would arrive at by chance or by extrapolation from the general rhythms of the facility. It was my Tuesday night, narrated to me by a 30-something man who had been asleep during most of it. I drove home after that shift and sat in my car in my own driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. I was not frightened. I want to be precise about that. I was not frightened the way one is frightened of a threat. I was frightened the way one is frightened on the edge of a high place, when the body registers a proximity before the mind is caught up. The dream started in October. I had not been a vivid dreamer before Harlow House, or if I was, I had not retained much of it. But in October, I began having a recurring dream that I want to describe as carefully as I can. In the dream, I am outside. It is night. I am standing in a residential street, the kind of quiet street behind a commercial strip, and I am looking up at a Victorian building. The building is lit from within. The ground floor windows show the warm low light of the common room. I can see the table, the coffee maker, the edge of the desk in the staff office. I am looking in from outside, which I have never done in waking life, because when I arrive for my shift, I enter through the back, through the parking lot. In the dream, there is a figure at the desk. The figure is doing what I do during slow parts of the shift. Writing, head down, the body posture of concentration. The figure is in my chair, in my position, at my desk. When the figure looks like me in the way that figures in dreams look like people you know. Not photographically exact, but immediately, unquestionably correct. The first time I had this dream, I woke before the figure looked up. The second time, in the third week of October, the figure turned slightly. A profile, not a full face. And I had the strong impression that the figure knew it was being watched. Not alarmed by it, accustomed to it. The figure went back to writing. I began to keep a separate record of the dreams, dated, in the back of my private notebook. I submitted my resignation in the first week of November. I gave the standard 2-week notice, and Dr. Perot accepted it graciously and said they would begin the search for a replacement. She asked if there was anything she could do to make the transition easier. I said no. I said I was grateful for the experience and meant it. My last shift was a Friday. Nothing unusual happened. The wellness checks were clean. The medication window was quiet. Odette said thank you at the window in the way she always did. Reuben showed me the current page of his sketchbook, which contained a figure at a window. Interior view looking out, the posture unresolved, as he described in August. He had not finished the figure's face. He said he was still working on the angle of the head. I said it was good work. I said good night. I did the final rounds, logged the final check, left the building at 6:03, and drove home. It has been nearly 3 months since my last shift at Harlow House. I have not returned to the building. I have had one phone conversation with a day shift colleague who was curious about my departure, and with whom I had always been friendly, and I told her I had needed a change, which was true. I called Dr. Perot once, about 3 weeks after leaving, to ask a clinical question I had been carrying, and she answered it patiently and asked if I was doing well, and I said yes. I am going to write now the things that have continued after my departure, and I am going to write them in the same careful way I have tried to write everything else in this account, because I do not want to give the impression that I have lost my grip on what is reasonable and what is not. The dream has continued. I expected it to resolve. I thought of it as a stress artifact, the product of prolonged exposure to a specific context. The kind of recurring image that dissolves when the context is removed. It has not dissolved. It has, if anything, become more detailed. The building in the dream looks more precisely like Harlow House than it did in October. The street is more specific. The light from the common room is more accurate. The figure at the desk is also more specific. Last week, the figure in my dream was not writing. The figure was sitting with the clipboard in its lap. The wellness check clipboard, the one I used for 8 months, and it was reviewing something on the clipboard. Its head was bent. It had not yet looked up, so I cannot tell you whether it was still recognizably me. But the posture was mine, and the clipboard was mine, and the position of the pen in the hand, held between the first two fingers, slightly angled, a habit I have always had, was mine. And 2 nights ago, in the dream, the figure looked up. I woke before the face resolved. This has happened enough times now that I have begun to suspect the waking is part of the pattern. That whatever is assembling this dream is not yet ready for that moment, or perhaps is waiting for something I haven't yet provided it. I have noticed in my daily life since leaving that I am more aware of the contents of rooms before I enter them. I don't mean this as a metaphor. I mean that I know, with an accuracy that I cannot account for, what position objects will be in when I walk through a door. My own objects in my own home, which is reasonable, but also the objects in my brother's kitchen when I visited him last month, and in the waiting room of my dentist's office, in which I had not been to in 18 months. I noticed this particularly at the dentist's office because they had rearranged the furniture since my last visit, and when I arrived, I already knew where the chairs were. I don't know what to do with this. I am writing it down because I said I would write everything. The last thing I want to record is about the notebook in the dream, the figure at the Harlow House desk, the figure that looks like me, that sits in my chair at my desk at my hours of the night, was reading from the clipboard last week. This week, the figure has a notebook, a small one, about the size of the one I have been writing this account in. The figure holds it in the same hand. The figure reads from it, head bent, with concentration. I cannot read what is in the notebook from where I stand on the street. We're outside the building, looking through the window. The glass distorts the text. But the handwriting from that angle, through the glass, in the amber wash of the common room light, is mine. I think it is reading this. I think it has been reading this for some time. I think whatever is accumulating inside that building has always been slightly ahead of me, has always received the material before I knew I was producing it, has always logged what I thought was private, has always been one beat ahead of the moment I arrive at awareness. I want to say, I am writing this down. I want to say, there is a record outside the building now, but the notebook in the dream has been there since October, and I only started writing this account in November, which means either I am wrong about when it started, or the building was reading ahead. And I have gone back and forth on which of those is worse. Some nights I can't tell the difference.